Thank you everybody for coming, and yet again, far more people on the call this evening than I thought would be there when I first volunteered. So I think Hillary, another success for this whole concept for the January virtual conference. What I'm presenting today is based on a package that Denise and I pulled together about a year ago, a bit more than a year ago, to increase the knowledge amongst the SOA coaches of the safety aspects of their roles. It actually has been designed as something that they can go through by themselves, and the validation questions at the back, which would lead almost inexorably to this being just a straight presentation. So Denise and I are going to try to break it up a bit, and I'm going to do that by asking questions, right? The way to deal with the responses, I suspect, given the numbers, is to put your answers or whatever your comments on chat, and Denise will pick them up, and then I'll try to answer them or comment on them as we go through. So this will happen about 4 or 5 times, that I'll take a pause and sort of say, right, well, the question at this point is, right? I'm also aware that we've got people here who are very experienced at doing risk assessments. We've probably got some people here who are not very experienced at doing risk assessments. For the people who are very experienced, please bear with it. I hope there might be something in it that is of interest to you, but a lot of it you should know. For the others, again, the purpose is not to bamboozle you. The purpose is to help you to understand. If you're not understanding, say so. We can spend a bit more time on topics. Right. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen, and I hate sharing screens on Zoom calls because then I can't see people. So I end up talking to a blank screen. That's the end, not the beginning. Right. Okay. So I'll now do the proper viewing of it. So it's a slideshow. Right. So let's just go through. So we're going to explain how to assess risks and control them. And remember, the criteria here is always an acceptable level. Some people talk about minimizing, but I always talk about controlling them to acceptable levels, because sometimes minimizing them takes too much more effort than it deserves. We're going to spend a little bit of time looking at different areas where coaching might go on, and what the hazards and the risks in those areas are. And the major part will be spent on looking at what is frequently called dynamic risk assessment, which sounds like a very grand term, but it's sort of what the risks which change, or the hazards which change, which leads to risks that change while coaching or while whatever the activity is going on, and how you handle that, right? And that is the area where people will get the most surprises, and it's the area where we will spend probably the most time. Right, very, very quickly, just to do this, while everybody talks about risk assessment, I like to talk about risk management, because too many people think that once you've done a risk assessment, you've signed it off on the dotted line, that's it, everything's done. But it isn't. Risk assessment is part of risk management. And the reason you do the risk assessment is so that you can identify where to put your efforts to control the risks, right? So the outcome you want is appropriate control of the risks. The risk assessment by itself is not the outcome, right? It's part of the way to getting the outcome. Now, there was a famous politician, I think in the UK, once made a comment that said that many people, or too many people really, spend too much time worrying about things that never happen. Well, in risk assessment, it's a bit different to that, in that the risk assessor spends their time considering what adverse things might happen, and then moves on to how they are going to avoid it or control it. Right? So it's a distortion of that once famous saying. Can I just quickly, as part of the recap, remember the hazard is the potential for harm, not the actual harm, and the risk is the probability that the harm will happen. Right? So if you're walking past a building and there's a sort of a big brick teetering on the very top, the hazard is that the brick will fall off. Right? The harm that will happen is when it hits somebody, and the risk is whether there's a high wind or something that will knock it off. Right? So the two tend to be, we tend to separate the two because how you deal with them varies with where it sits. So the risk assessment process, first of all, understand the activity. If you don't understand the activity, you're going to be very hard pushed to identify what the problems are. And next you identify the hazards. Now we're going to look at coaching situations, and I've warned you that there would be pauses. Well, quite early on, here's the first pause. The question I'm going to ask here is, it's always a good idea to identify the significant hazards first, right? And then deal with the lesser hazards. So for a typical forest coaching activity, my challenge to you, my question to you is, what are the significant hazards you might want to think of at the start of the risk assessment? Right? So comments or chat to Denise, she'll share them with us, and we can then have a discussion about some of those.
Could you reiterate the question again, please, Tim?
The question is, what are the significant hazards that you would expect to see in typical forest coaching?
I think I'll just read them out as they come. Is that okay, Tim?
Pardon?
I'll read them out as they come.
Yeah, that's fine.
The road journey to get there. Tripping.
Yes. Right.
Tripping, slipping, other people and their activities in the forest, adverse weather, changing terrain, weather, water hazards, others in the forest, getting out of the map area. Poisoned trees, crags,
right.
Poisonous animals, terrain loss participant.
Now, the poisonous animals is an interesting one. I mean, bees, wasps.
Snakes. Dogs.
Yes. Yep.
Not that they're poisonous. The weather possibility, the terrain, animals, snakes, electrical storms.
Yep. Can I? Okay, that's an excellent set. Thank you very much. Can I just take a few? While the risk, probably the greatest risk, is the journey to and from the forest. Generally, you would take that wouldn't be within the scope of the activity. So whoever the coach is who's preparing the risk assessment will probably not include that, unless there's a specific saying, well, we're all going to meet at such a point, and then we're going to head to somewhere else, in which case the journey might become part of the activity. So understand, when I say understand the activity, you also need to understand the scope. Roads, other people in the forest, I mean, mountain bikers. Once on a coaching session, we encountered people on motorbikes, right? These sorts of things can be problems. People riding horses, deer. Right? I know of one instance, not in a coaching session, I must admit, where an orienteer was floored by a deer.
In Canada, you have to watch out for moose, because they actually attack you.
Yes, and bears. Right. Okay. Thank you very much for that quick input. Let's carry on. So you've identified your hazards. That's your first column, really, of your risk assessment. Now you look at it is how likely is it? Well, what harm might occur, and how likely is it? And then by putting those two together, you're doing the risk assessment side. This is the risk, and the next question is that risk low and acceptable? Right? If it's unacceptable, then you need to put some extra precautions in place, or you need to add precautions. If it's acceptable, document it and carry on. It is perfectly allowable to say, yes, this is a risk, and we believe that the precautions we've got in place are sufficient. You don't need then to write an action. It's done. Just document it. Right? So one of the things that the risk assessment does is it communicates what the hazards are and it communicates what the required precautions are. It also allows you, if there's a shortfall, to identify your actions. And again, the actions have got to be realistic and they've got to be done. You know, if you've got a written document that says, ah, yes, we're going to do the following things, and then you don't do it and something goes wrong, you've got problems because you've more or less shown that you didn't carry out what you had already identified you needed to do. Right. This is a little chart. We'll share the presentation afterwards. People can look at it. But what it actually says is if you determine that a risk is, the precautions are insufficient and you go round the loop again. So you then put in a precaution and you've got to assess whether that precaution is significant. It is, sorry, not significant, if it reduces the risk to an acceptable level. So if you're trying to cross a motorway as a pedestrian and you decide to paint you can say, okay, well, we're going to make it a zebra crossing on the motorway, right? That's not going to work effectively. So you've come up with an action to do, and it doesn't reduce the risk to an acceptable level. Therefore, you still need to do something else, right? Or ditch it and find something that's better. Right. So we sum up what people are saying. Consider the hazards in the categories. Where's the area that the coaching is being held? You might want to look at the route from parking to the coaching area. Who are the participants? Right? Do they have special issues? Allergies, other health conditions? It's a good idea to have those. Are there particular risks associated with that? What about the others? The people on the mountain bikes, the people who are, I don't know, I suppose you could end up as people out shooting, that sort of thing. What's the weather? How's it going to change? Is there going to be a storm? Are you going to find that the wind gets too high? The wind is forecast to get up to 50 miles an hour. Do you really want to be in the forest? Right? Equipment. I think the equipment side is generally lower hazard, but it again depends how you're running it. If the event has got a generator, then you've got to start thinking about the risks associated with the generator. Right? There is a checklist produced by British Orienteering. The only comment I'd say about it is the checklist has lots and lots of potential hazards on it, which is one of the reasons why I say focus on the big ones first, please. Once you've identified the big ones, then you can go and just check whether you've got the rest. Right. Step 2, having got your hazards, you've got to look at, I said, you've got to identify the risk level and decide if trivial, acceptable, or too high. Right? So we've already identified what the hazards are. Let's have a quick think as to what your main precautions are going to be for a coaching session in the forest. So forget your generator, it isn't a big event, this is a coaching session in the forest. What are you going to do around your precautions? Right? Well, the key precautions you're going to have. So we've got things about, some of the big hazards are other people, dangerous beasties, terrain. So what are the key things? Denise, if you can call out any that you get sent, that'd be great.
Yep. Judith has started us off with first aid kit.
Right.
Medical forms filled in by participants, first aiders, kit, shelter, more first aid, pre-brief, coaches in forest. Pre-brief. Ensure extra clothing is bought, safety briefing, count people in and out, communication devices, generically reduce the impact of the hazard, avoid the hazard. Search team, pre-brief local, pre-discussion, tape off hazard. Did I miss any there? Mobile phone, charged and in service, appropriate clothing.
What about the terrain?
So what do you mean by that?
Well, I mean,
Design courses that lead away from
one of the things you might do is, say you've got some crags around, is you obviously want to choose your exercises to keep people away from the crags.
Right, which is what Caroline's identified. Check terrain, select appropriate terrain for the particular group, design courses that lead away from hazards.
Yep. Okay. These are the sorts of things, and I suppose if you've got less experienced people, I think we've covered in there sort of what to do if they get lost. You might actually want to put somebody out at a key point where, you know, if they go past that point, they might be disappearing for a few miles of forest.
A comment just from Ian, just saying who owns each risk. I guess who's in charge of each risk is the coach, the planner, the parents, I suppose, who's looking after those risks, identifying communication, safety, bearing, check weather forecasts. Yeah, lots of good stuff there.
Okay, that's great. That's great. Thanks. The only point it's an excellent list. Thank you very much. What I'd add to it is the big comment is, if you have a risk that you cannot get to an acceptable level, then don't do it. Don't do the activity, right? Because, as I've said, just writing down the risk assessment is not the end in itself. It's the risk management that's all important, right? And the British Orienteering form is very good for this. It leads you through it so you can document the hazard, the risk, and any actions you need to do. It's very simple, and I think it's excellent, right? Just use it, and use it the way it's meant. I mean, it's almost identical to the HSE form for risk assessment. The only thing about the HSE form is it has an extra column as who is responsible for the action, right? But in the British Orienteering one, that gets incorporated in the third column. So it's very, very good, nice and simple. Use it, right? Oh, and I keep emphasizing this. If you're handing an action to somebody else and you're doing the risk assessment, they only stand a chance of doing it if you tell them. Ask them, sorry. Right? Okay. Now, I mentioned, and somebody came back, I mentioned the precautions hierarchy, right, in the preliminary information about this, and somebody came back and said they'd never heard about it, right? This tends to be used in industry because it's to do with the robustness of the precaution that's put in place, right? So when you've got a risk that's too high and you've got to put some precaution in place, the strongest one is, can you remove or avoid the hazard, right? So you've got crags in the forest, you're worried about somebody falling off the top of one because it's got thick vegetation just before the top. You make certain the courses don't go anywhere near it, right? You might also make certain that anybody coming towards the crag on a course, even if they're sort of well away from it, is coming towards the bottom side of it rather than the top, right? Because you can't fall up a crag, you can fall down one, right? So this is the concept that if you can remove the hazard, then your problem's gone away. You're no longer worried about risk because the risk is zero. It's about the only time you will ever get a risk to zero. If you think there's a big hazard from driving to an event, you can avoid that hazard by going by train, as long as there's a train service, right? So that's the strongest one. The next one down is, can you reduce the probability of the harm occurring, right? So, and you can do this either by physical methods or by system methods. Physical tend to be regarded as having greater impact. So, in part, a barrier, some form of barrier, is a physical method. If you've got say a deep pit, and you want people to, the courses are going past it, and you construct some barrier, normally a robust barrier around it, then you have provided a physical reduction in the probability of somebody getting into that pit, right? So that's the second one. And the third one, which is very rarely applicable, well, it is applicable in certain cases within orienteering, but generally you don't want to go there, is can you reduce the severity of the harm if the undesirable circumstance arises? And the classic one for reducing the severity of harm is wearing a seatbelt, right? So a seatbelt only comes useful if you're in a vehicle that's in a collision, and then it becomes extremely useful. What you'd really like is to reduce the probability of the collision, right? That's a higher level of protection, but the seatbelt becomes your fail-safe. And because it is reducing the severity of the harm, it is your last line of defense. If it doesn't function properly, the harm happens, and that's why it's not really favored. Okay, so that's the three levels, and when you look at applying precautions, you should be looking at that. Can I remove or avoid the hazard? If I can't, how do I reduce the probability of the harm occurring? And finally, if that's not sufficient, how can I reduce the severity? Right. So we've got another exercise here. So if everybody can see it, what we're saying is a school group heading to a coaching session in a minibus. This is pre-COVID. Right? It becomes much more complicated if you regard this as COVID, but we'll take it pre-COVID. Here are the precautions identified for the traveller below. Right? I've just run through them, and I'm going to ask people that their views as to which are the most robust precautions that we're talking about. Right? So each seat has a seatbelt. We've already mentioned the seatbelt, so I've told you where that one fits. The minibus has a working ABS, assisted braking system. Right? The driver has attended defensive driving training. The minibus has a working lane departure alarm, an automatic. Sorry, I can't see that because it's just automatic braking if you get too close to the vehicle in front. This is a modern, sometimes found on modern cars. The school policy is the driver must be feeling in reasonable health, so he must be in reasonable condition to drive, not feeling ill. And the driver should take a break from driving roughly every 2 hours. Right. So if you can just sort of give a view as to which are the strongest precautions there and which are the weakest, where they fit within the hierarchy. And Denise can just jot it down, and Denise can give a view on it.
Okay, next time we do this exercise, Tim, let's put the numbers beside, so then people can
Sorry,
go.
yes, I should do that.
Or maybe we can even just do that.
Well, take them as numbered 1,
numbers,
2,
yeah.
3, 4, 5, and 6.
Five, Anthony is suggesting, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's the
That's the
school
one.
policy that the driver must be feeling in reasonable health. Strongest wearing seatbelt, weakest feeling in reasonable health. Strongest is brake. Strongest is 1, weakest is 3. Strongest is seatbelt, weakest is the driver has attended defensive training. Strong 1, 3, 6. Weak is 2 and 4. I can't read them all out so quickly. 5,
Okay.
3, yeah.
Right. Thank you for that. Obviously, some quite different opinions.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
An ABS system only becomes of use once you're in a situation which you'd rather not be in, having to brake hard and skidding, right? So that's sort of the lowest level, as is wearing a seatbelt, right? Because seatbelt is only of use if it's to protect the individual and to reduce the level of harm. The driver taking a break roughly every 2 hours, that's very useful to stop the driver from falling asleep, as is the driver feeling in reasonable health and being required to say that they're in reasonable health. And the driver having attended defensive driving, that is actually in the middle precaution. That is a system approach to reducing the probability of having an accident, right? So that one's actually quite high in the hierarchy, and well worth doing. When I was working, I used to have all the drivers in the business, all people who drive reasonably went through defensive driving, and had a drastic impact, a very good impact on reducing the number of collisions and injuries. The lane departure alarm and automatic. Well, I don't know. That should be quite sort of reasonably up in the hierarchy. I just don't know how reliable they are, so I wouldn't like to comment on that. Okay, we'll keep moving on then. Right. Now we're getting into a little bit more detail, sort of, and for open forests, what are the sorts of things now? And we've seen pretty well all of these coming up already. I'm just going to go through them in case we've got some people who haven't done much of this. So weather, sort of temperature extremes, both hot and cold, right? If it gets too hot, orienteering becomes quite hazardous as well. High winds. What is the speed of the wind that people will find? They say, well, we're not going into the woods. And you could say, well, if you go in the woods and you can hear all the trees creaking, and you feel uncomfortable, unsafe, then that's too high. Yes, but that's a heck of a test to go and expose yourself to the hazard to then decide that you don't want to be there. Lightning, and heavy rain and flooding. Right. Can anybody remember the Om or the Carrymore as it was then? I think 2006, sometime like that, when there was reports of 1,000 people missing overnight. But actually, the various participants, most of them, and then they finished because nobody was actually lost and there were no real problems, maintained that they regretted the fact that the event was called off. They thought it was an incorrect decision. Right. What about the area? This is terrain. It's mine shafts, pits, things like that cause problems. Actually, if you've got heavy rain, sometimes what looks like a nice peaceful burn becomes a very fast flowing one before the end of the event. High fences, particularly for the more elderly, that they may struggle quite hard they may find them quite difficult to get over, right? And that has to be watched out for, particularly if there's a couple of strands of barbed wire at the top, right? Then the participants, we've already mentioned known health issues, lost competitors, other people you have to consider quite sort of take a good view as to, are you going to get mountain bikers? Is it a known mountain biking area, right? And equipment. I mean, this is fairly serious equipment side. If we move on now to next area.
Tim, I was just going to give you just a good time check. It's just slightly after 8, so I think you're
That's
ticking
fine.
along really nicely, but just to let you know.
Yep, I think we're just about on schedule then. Right, let's move to the urban area now. Okay, and weather, ice, again, temperature, high winds, lightning. High winds this time are more likely to building damage, or there could be trees within the urban environment. Steep slopes, slippery slopes, and again, high fences. And now for participants, it's lost competitors is one, but collisions with other people, particularly people who aren't taking part, is a concern. And when I was doing this at some point, I mentioned that I thought there would be an opportunity that sooner or later a pedestrian would be taken out, and somebody sent me a clip of, I think, an elite event somewhere in Italy, and a chap was running at full tilt down a narrow alley, and there was a restaurant, and somebody came out of the restaurant straight into his path and got flattened, right? So these are significant issues, and they have to be taken account of. And blind alleys, it's frequently controls might be placed in a blind alley. It's a good way of checking whether people are very precise. But somebody going into a blind alley to punch a control, if it's narrow, as they're coming out, they might have a risk of running into somebody coming in. Right? So these are the sorts of areas that need to be looked at. Any other views on urban risks and hazards that people can think of? Again, so just give a quick input to Denise.
Yeah, it says in urban can be map issues, recrossing points, and OOB crossings.
Quite very serious issues associated with that, and even I think, interestingly, that actually has an impact on some of the planning, because if you want everybody to go, if there's an underpass, but some people think it's quicker to go across a busy road, then the planning, you really need the planning to say, okay, we're going to put a control in that underpass to force everybody through the underpass.
A couple more points, just Tim, curbs and speed bumps, clearly tripping. And yes. Stephen, builders carrying a sheet of glass, happened to be in London. Wow.
Has that happened?
Bad timing, sounds like it.
Ouch.
Concrete barriers, road barriers, mass start events really need really careful thought about where the start can be.
Yes.
Comments.
Could I just ask whether people have seen the video for? Now it was an indoor orienteering event in Edinburgh, associated with the big weekend a number of years ago, 2018 or something like that. Has anybody seen the video taken of that? Well, you won't be able to answer me directly, but if you look at it, the course actually goes outside on not quite the roof, but near the roof. And it just happened, it was very, very cold. And there is, it's on YouTube if you find it, but there is a heart-stopping moment in that where, because it was very cold, it was icy. And the first time you see somebody slip and fly and go flying, so people are going along wearing their whatever GoPros. You know, somebody slips and lands on their backside. Yeah, that's funny. But then somebody slipped going round a corner, and as they're going down, you can see a concrete ledge right beside them. And for that fraction of a second, you think that they're going to crack their head on the ledge as they go down. Right? They miss. But
so Tim,
yep.
Just a few comments. And I will just summarize to say, I think we're getting a bit more into event safety rather than coaching.
Yes.
Perhaps I know all the stories are great and fun, and it's all.
Yeah. Okay. Fine.
Steer it back.
We'll carry on from here. The other one is indoors. Right. Coaching events do happen indoors, and frequently in a gym or something like that. And if you get lots of people there and they're all running around, how do you keep them away from each other so you don't end up with collisions? Right? There's a steady trickle of reported injuries to people from collisions on indoor coaching. Right? So please be aware of that. Right. I said we were going to deal with hazards and risks that change. Right? So now moving into this area, you can have the hazards alter with very, very little warning. This is a sudden change in weather, even if somebody is injured, because that now alters the number of people you've got to look after everybody else. I've been, actually when I was being trained on my coaching training, we were doing some exercises and some off-road motorcyclists turned up to use part of the area. Right? So the hazards changed. It's not realistic and probably confusing if you tried to put all of these into your initial risk assessment, because they've got to be credible situations. But then at this point, if you're the lead coach, you need to be reconsidering your risk assessment and looking for what precautions you put in place immediately. right? I said some of these which can change at the last minute are possible, they're predictable hazards. So what happens if somebody goes missing? You've sent people out on a coaching loop and somebody doesn't come back, or there's a sudden deterioration in weather. So you can deal with that, but then there's the ones which you really wouldn't have thought of, right? One of the other ones that happened on my coaching session was that some people turned up flying model aircraft, and they were flying them relatively low, and I think they had a little runway in the middle of nowhere, and we were probably in line with the runway, right? So then obviously we just moved, but these things can happen. So if you're leading a session and the unexpected arises, then it's the coach normally it will fall to, or to delegate it to somebody to assess the risk on the hazard on the spot, what the risks are, and how you're going to control them, right? And this is, as I said, where it starts to get challenging, right? So we've got another example here. I'll just take you through it. So this is in a forest in May, 4 coaches, 20 people, of which half of them are juniors. There's a variety of abilities there, and actually the group is divided of 20 is divided up into 3, looking at different technical difficulty levels. So we're 45 minutes in, and one junior complains of sore eyes and is distressed. Her father there has come along to help out. So he goes to her and says, okay, I don't know what the problem is, but I'm taking you back to the car about 400 meters away so as to assess the issue, see what there is. He actually had another child at the session. They were happy to carry on. So I'm now putting you all in the position. You're the lead coach of that session. So what are you now thinking about? You don't know what's caused this. Right? Answers to Denise?
There's some great comments going on in the chat. And thankfully, they're all saved. Hillary, that last one was very good. Thank you very much. The reasons why orienteering coaches should not be working on their own. Okay, coming in, let's see. Oh my gosh, for what are her father's plans? Were you counting on him for anything else? That's one comment. Could be chemicals. Could other participants suffer from the same complaint? Check if a personal issue or could be wider. Allergy to something. Use other parents to liaise. Stop now. Could be something everyone could be affected by, those poisonous caterpillars.
Okay. Yeah, just to fill you in, there was an exchange of mobile phone numbers before the father went away, right? And I'm now okay. So that's at that stage. Now part 2, right? So 10 minutes later, a young leader who's been assisting the coaches complains of feeling unwell, and while checking what was wrong with them, a rash can be seen developing on their neck and face. So one of the coaches' first aiders is now allocated to look after them. So we had 4, we're now down to 3. They leave the forest and phone back that the rash is still developing and that the junior's parent is calling NHS 24. So you're the lead coach. What's changed with your risk assessment now?
Get people out of the forest as soon as possible. That's coming from Ian. The risk is much greater. The group should be brought back. Unknown hazard in the forest, so get people back. Ratio to coach to participant has changed. Stop session, recall everybody. Many few helpers not viable now.
Yeah, I mean,
stop training, warn others of problems, get parents to pick up. So sounds as though it's stop and regroup and get people out. If there's any chance if 2 incidences are related, then get out quick.
Right.
Is that enough?
Okay. So here's so the first part one, as we said, unknown hazard, raises a concern that there might be a potential issue. You've still got 4 coaches, so parent checking is a good option for checking out the issue. It might be something in the eye. No other signs, so carry on. Part 2, now it's much more serious. Maybe an allergic reaction. The first aid kit doesn't contain antihistamines, right? Unknown problem, unknown source, but now it's like 2 people have been affected. So while there are enough coaches to keep the session running, the decision taken at the time was to stop the session. Everybody was accounted and everybody left, but no further cases, right? Just as a follow-up, because this actually happened, NHS 24 advised use of antihistamines, which neither of the 2 people had a history of allergies, and therefore somebody had to go to a local petrol station to get some, and that got rid of the symptoms, although the second person was still not very well the following day. It then transpired, as we started talking to them, that the 2 had been paired in an exercise, and they'd come into contact with a fungal growth. So, but as I said, neither of them had any known history of susceptibilities or allergies. But it's an example of how things can develop and the sequential steps. I agree entirely with people's assessments. It's really encouraging that people did that. I, by the way, was the lead coach. Right. So let's move on then to foreseeable situations, right? So the main foreseeable situation that requires a dynamic assessment is a missing person. It could be an injured person, a change in weather, but the most common likely one is a missing person. And it's already said that if it's foreseeable, you can have a plan. So if you're a coach, or particularly lead coach, it's very good idea to have a plan for a missing person. You've got to address the risks for everyone. So you've got one person, I hope just one person missing, but you've got everybody else. So you've still got to look at the risks to and the welfare of the remaining group. But you've also got to now start thinking about search coordination. How do you avoid losing searchers? Well, potentially you want people who, you want to have some maps available, and you want people who know what they're doing about reading the maps. Who are you going to send out to search? Are you going to send the first aiders, given that coaches tend to be the first aiders? Or do you want somebody with first aid skills to be at the obvious assembly point, which is where you've been, the centre point for your coaching session? How you need people who you might be sending out and people who are staying behind to understand what their role is and how you're going to communicate. And you also need to have a view as to when you are going to get additional help, right? Hilary, I think you said that from the previous one, it's a very good example as to why you shouldn't coach alone. I agree entirely. If you might coach alone if you've got one person, and it's sort of simple coaching that way. But if you've got a group of people, generally you want to have 2 coaches at least, if not more. Right. Okay, are people happy on that? Any comments about the search and rescue side of things for coaching? Denise, anything coming through?
No, nothing yet, but
Okay.
I can, yep.
Right, that's dealt with most of it. The last few slides I want to deal with, going through now, are just information for people, right? So reporting injuries, the requirements for that are specified by the insurers, and the reports go to British Orienteering. There is what is called an events insurance accident report form, and details here are provided as to whereabouts you can find it on the British Orienteering website. right? I mentioned that because you do actually need to know where it is if you when you want to go looking. Otherwise, it could take you a little while. The categories for those reporting of industrial injuries, the categories there are for industrial injuries. They are specified by the Health and Safety Executive for industrial injuries. And as such, not all of them are obvious as being related to orienteering. Right? One of the comment there about a separate file, that is because within SOA we are trying to get more information on the types of injuries that might happen.
Sorry, Tim, just to interrupt. Just send the link to people. That was amazing timing on our part. The links that we are collecting the incidents that you set up last year.
Yeah, but this is a voluntary side of it. By the way, what I haven't said naturally is that the requirement for reporting injuries arises from our insurance company. It does not rise from the Health and Safety Executive, right? The one thing that does come from the Health and Safety Executive is there is a requirement for reporting any required hospital visit by a member of public arising directly from the activity, right? And it says required, and the distinction is between required and precautionary, right? So if a member of the public gets hurt during an orienteering activity like coaching, then if somebody sort of says, oh, well, I'm uncertain, perhaps as a precaution we should send them to hospital, there isn't a requirement for reporting that. If there is no doubt about it, this person needs to go to hospital, there's a requirement for reporting. Okay? With incidents, the insurance requirement for reporting is not tied to regulations, right? The regulation that sets out the injuries by the Health and Safety Executive in an industrial environment also sets out incidents, but they are sufficiently far away from orienteering that doesn't work. Effectively, you report incidents where you believe that a claim may be made against either an orienteering club or British Orienteering, right? Where that, I leave that to you to interpret, but it's your judgment if you're the coach, right? Again, Denise has sent out a link. We have actually, for SOA, defined a list of coaching-related incidents that we would like to know about, right? But that is outside of that's an SOA initiative, not a general British Orienteering initiative. Right. The reason being that we believe that there is learning to be gained by looking at incidents and injuries, and we've said that we would then anonymise them and share the learning, but not the details of the people involved or even the location. We haven't actually had many because we introduced this last February and there hasn't been much orienteering since, right? And just to finish up, well, I've got one last slide after this. Insurance. There does seem at times when you talk to people some uncertainty about what insurance is available. So let me just say, British Orienteering provides personal or professional indemnity insurance for licensed coaches, but not for non-licensed coaches, right? So if you want to have professional indemnity insurance for your coaching activity, then you need to be licensed, right? Now, participants in activities registered with British Orienteering have third-party liability cover, right? That doesn't mean that they've got personal injury insurance because British Orienteering doesn't provide it. It means that if a third party wishes to bring a claim arising from what's going on in the activity, then there is insurance with British Orienteering that covers it, right? Should participants wish to have some form of insurance for themselves while participating in either an event or an activity, they need to get it for themselves. Right. And finally, I'll come to the summary, and then we've got a little bit of time for questions and discussion. Well, got plenty of time, really. Well, I've said risk assessment is a route to get everyone to address safety risks for task or activity, hopefully using a common language and a common system, right? Remember that you've also got to apply it to changes. I'm not going to go into it in detail, but should you ever find yourself with nothing to do for a while and you download the Lion Air 737 MAX crash incident report, one of the key factors contributing to that was that changes were made without appropriate assessment of the risks, right? And that's to do with this software system, right? So changes, when people make changes, they frequently change the hazards or the risks, and therefore the assessment needs to include that. I've next said risk assessment is not difficult, but it's also not simple. It requires effort. So the steps and the system provided by the British Orienteering form are very good. They are simple. If you use them fully, they work, right? Address the whole activity, and you've got to think of what is likely to have to go wrong, right? So forget your positive thinking for a time, look at what might go wrong, and then look at what you do to mitigate that or prevent it. So be objective. Wishful thinking is not a risk assessment. Oh, I really hope that nothing goes wrong today. No, that's not a risk assessment. You've got to actually stand back and sort of take your personal wishes out of it. And I said here, if in doubt, ask others, particularly around coaching, actually, because coaches will be more than happy to provide and share experiences and views around risks and precautions. Collaboration usually improves assessments, right? As long as you don't get into a sort of let's all reinforce each other's views. This isn't really a problem, but generally collaboration improves the assessments. So, and the final comment, it's applied common sense with a bit of structure, and that's really what it is. Right. I think that's roughly come to the end of what I had to say. Denise,
Well, I've asked.
we will share this presentation, I assume?
Yes, happy to do that if you're happy to, and it's certainly being recorded, and I'm sure Peter will put it on the BOF website.
Okay, any questions or comments?
I'm waiting for something to come in from the chat. I think the last comment that you made, or the last part of the slide, was the common sense, but I suppose common sense really it's only developed through experience, isn't it?
Common sense isn't that common.
Well, yeah, that's true, but I just mean it's good common sense and activity. But what I mean is that it's gained experience through experience, things that have worked or haven't worked. Takes a lot of years to develop the common sense that you're talking about.
Yes, I mean, I'll step aside and give a personal view that while there isn't very much sharing of experience and experience when things go wrong within British Orienteering. I'm not blaming British Orienteering. I'm saying orienteers don't share things other than personal contacts, and yet, sort of time and again, industries will tell you that there's a colossal amount to be learnt from when something does go wrong, right? And so what's that about? Well, it's about providing the experience without having to have the negative consequences of something going wrong to you personally or to your organisation. And it is an area that I think we need to improve, and that's why SOA have introduced sort of somewhat more stringent injury and illness and incident reporting requirements to our members, to say, because we want to get more information so that we can share and so that we can improve the learning and the quality of the risk management. Right.
There's a few comments coming in. I'll just read out a couple of them. Anthony, thank you. A good reminder, refresher, thank you. We haven't mentioned loose dogs in the forest, which is always scary for people. John Cooley's asked, are SOA's foundation and level 1 coaches considered licensed coaches by BOF? So we should answer that question. Tim, do you want to go for that one?
Foundation coaches, no. Level 1, yes.
That was the question. Yep. Oh, for us, not the audience. Sorry. Oh, well.
Oh, I didn't answer the loose dogs one. No, I really haven't got a solution to that. I mean, it's particularly relevant. Well, we are particularly aware of it right now because we have a junior who is terrified of dogs, and we sort of more or less have to have a view as to any forest to tell the parents as whether we think it's okay for them to go have a run around.
Just a few other comments. Are you reading them as well, Tim? Facilitating this, I imagine that's the shared experience through mentoring and conferences. Definitely, I feel we've lost some of that within our club experience sharing. Now people do the event safety course online rather than gathering. Very true. I guess it depends on if the virtual event safety workshop is actually just the individual workshop or the one where you're doing jointly online. Certainly we do the jointly online one here. Yeah, there's a lot in there. Tim, is there anything in particular that you want to wrap up with?
I think what I'd say is that what's happened since since lockdown started last March is that both SOA and British Orienteering have taken the opportunity to revamp their safety offerings. So there is now a lot more information available. There are different formats, different ways of getting it, but it's all directed at the same thing, which is to make people more aware. And I think that probably the next thing we need to do is to improve our sharing of information so that we don't have to say to people, oh, well, it's every January or sometime like that, this will be something will be shared on this, but we can actually have regular sharing and regular reinforcement of the principles here, because nobody ever does a perfect risk assessment. I mean, well, I never do a perfect risk assessment. That's probably a simpler way of saying it. And to me, there's always learning to be picked up from sort of just going to events, looking at what goes on, how things are run at events. You know, if you go and just look around, you will see things that sort of say, "Oh yes, we could incorporate that."
Great. Well,
Okay.
thank you everybody for coming. If there are any other questions or comments, please pop it in there. I think otherwise we will wrap up. Tim, that was a really excellent session. Thank you very much. We've done a few of them together, and that one was, I think, the most enjoyable one I've been involved with. So thank you. You were spot on with all of that. It was a good
Well,
session.
actually, I think I ought to thank the people who were on last Thursday as well, because they were nudging me to change things a bit as how things are presented, and we've listened, and this is all I can say.
Great. Excellent. Well, there's certainly more conference sessions coming up. One this Thursday, and that's the additional support needs, and then a couple of next week. Sorry, I don't know them off the top of my head, but lots going on. And thank you everybody for your time. And let's just keep chatting and listening to each other and making this a better sport for everybody. So I'm going to close the meeting. Tim, thank you. Hillary, thanks again. Good night, everybody.
Right, right.
Thanks, Tim. That was great.
Okay.